I have my co-conspirator here on the what's been come to be known by conservatives in the legislature as the Obamacare kill bill. So, and Andy and I are joint sponsors on House Bill 91. And we've spoken at several different venues, and Andy likes to go first. So, Andy Thompson.
Well, good afternoon. Ron and I divided our speech into sort of a overview philosophical piece, and then Ron will get into the meat and potatoes of our bill. Suffice it to say, we think it's a pretty effective approach to stopping Obamacare in the state of Ohio, and we realize that has multiple ramifications down the road. So we're working on, assuming that we're successful on this, then how do we address the marketplace once we blow it up in Ohio, I guess. But I just wanted to talk about where my background, and I spent 4 years on Capitol Hill in the late 80s, and it was then that I first learned about the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. I was with a group called the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is a free market think tank. You might have heard of their work on debunking global warming, trying to help in the drug approval process. They've done a lot of things. They have a program they call Death by Regulation, which shows that how often the regulations, whether it's in the matter of drug approval or fuel economy standards, often leads to death in the regulatory process. And I just wanted to commend you as a group for your stands, not merely in the medical field, but also in some of the other areas, whether it's pro-life issues, gun issues, and others. You're a group that's very loyal to our Bill of Rights and our American freedoms, and I think this bill is very much reflective and consistent with that. Some of the other things I want to tell you quickly that we've done in the Ohio legislature: Medicaid expansion is one that we've opposed here in the Ohio House, and I think done so pretty effectively to date. We're hoping that that is sustained. We hear that the Ohio Senate obviously will be not putting that back in the bill. That's what they tell us, and so we're pleased by that. So there are a lot of ways that we're trying to disable government rather than enable government, and your not counterpart group, the AMA is never, I don't know how you refer to them as maybe the evil empire, is not a lot of help in us as we try to leave choice up to individuals and their doctors rather than turning it over to government bureaucrats. And I really lament what government intrusion into health care has meant to your profession. I think Obamacare can represent a fatal blow to your profession, and you see as we go into this more expensive government bureaucracy, physicians are needed less and less as we dump the business down to physician assistants and people who will cost less. All that investment that you made in your education and student loans is going to be dismissed as we go to rationing and other bad things that are going to happen in healthcare. So I appreciate the principled stands that you all are taking. I want you to know that, obviously here in Ohio you have good friends, but this has national implications, certainly. If we're able to accomplish what we can in Ohio, I think that will radiate out to the other states. That's a component of the bill that we've been working on. I also want to acknowledge a friend from Marietta, since I'm from Marietta. Dr. Richard Kane is back here, so I was happy to see a friendly face. We've got work to do to get more physicians to understand what it is that you all represent and why what you do is important, because fundamentally there's a fair argument to be made that insurance certainly didn't make healthcare a better profession, much less government insurance. So we're with you philosophically on that. We want to do what we can. We call ourselves the broom and the spokes of Obamacare to try and have legislation that disables it so that our forces can regroup and continue to strongly oppose and ultimately disable this. Medicaid expansion, and I'm sorry, I don't want to take too much time, but Medicaid expansion to me was one more example of a terrible idea of inducing people with their own tax dollars to do something that they know is not right. So they're saying, well, there's this pile of money. If you'll just take this pile of money and do exactly what we tell you, things will all work out well. I think our governor, unfortunately, has drunk that medicine, and it's a bad idea. And again, we're here in Ohio. We're going to continue to oppose that. We're pleased to have friends like your colleague here to give us the opportunity to speak. And at this point, I will turn it over to my colleague and good friend, Ron Young.
Thanks. I have a quote here from Ronald Reagan. He said this 40 years ago. And I think this is really fascinating. He says, this is a quote from him. In 1927, an American socialist, Norman Thomas, 6 times candidate for president on the Socialist Party ticket, said the American people would never vote for socialism. After this last presidential election, you might question that. And he goes on, he says, but he said, under the name of liberalism, the American people will adopt every fragment of the socialist program. Every fragment of the socialist program. One of the traditional methods of imposing statism or socialism on a people has been by way of medicine. This is the part that really touched me. He says, and this is so appropriate today, it is very easy to distinguish a medical program, it is very easy to disguise a medical program as a humanitarian project. Most people are a little reluctant to oppose anything that suggests medical care for people who possibly can't afford it. Again, that's Ronald Reagan. And where did we just see that recently? In the Medicaid debate. You heard our leaders here in Ohio stand up and say that unless we pass this, people will be dying on the streets. People will be suffering under bridges with nowhere to go, no hope of a cure. We have to pass this bill. You know, regardless of the fact that this nation is currently $17 trillion in debt, regardless of the fact that the medical outcomes for those on Medicaid, if you look at their outcomes, is almost indistinguishable from those that have no coverage whatsoever, irregardless of the fact that the biggest factor that's just consuming our state budget is Medicaid. It's over 40% of our state budget now. We're talking about putting almost 500,000 more people on the program. And it seems like every time we reach a point in this country where a big government program isn't working, what do we do to fix it? We make it bigger. We make it bigger. Or we say, well, it's just not good enough. We'll perfect the program because we're smarter than the guys that just did it 5 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever. Everybody wants to play God. Everybody thinks they have the answer, when the answer should be just smaller government, more free enterprise, more self-determination. So Ronald Reagan really had it right. So what we're talking about here today, though, is House Bill 91. And by the way, if you're from Ohio, or even if you're not, the Medicaid discussion in Ohio is not over, in spite of the fact that we did manage to get it out of the House version of the budget. There is still talk, I believe, in the Senate that they may do something, although I think Andy is much more tied into what happens over there than I am. So, all right. So it looks as if, at least for the time being, that we have kept Medicaid out, but it's not a dead issue. So please stay tuned in for more information on that. A little bit of history on House Bill 91. What was its genesis? Well, first of all, we passed in Ohio our Ohio Constitutional Amendment back in 2011. And I'll just read a brief excerpt from that. The Healthcare Freedom Act 1.0, passed by referendum almost 2-to-1 here in Ohio in 2011. It reads, no federal, state, or local law or rule shall compel directly or indirectly any person, employer, or healthcare provider to participate in a healthcare system. So what does Obamacare do? Exactly the opposite of this, right? So obviously, Obamacare withstood the NFIB's challenge in court, at least to a point. The whole bill was not ruled constitutional. Only small portions of it were. It's still vulnerable to other constitutional challenges. But for the time being, it still stands. That being the case, Ohio's Constitution is about to be thoroughly preempted in January of 2014, just around the corner. They keep telling us that this is predetermined. It's predestined. This is going to happen no matter what. That's why Andy and I are working on House Bill 91, though. At the same time, I was so thankful when our governor did not set up a state exchange. What's the major thing that happens with a state exchange? The major thing is that the subsidies from Obamacare flow through the state exchanges under the exact language of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. If you read it literally, that's what it says. The subsidies flow through the state exchanges. And without the subsidies, there can be no penalties. We'll get into that later on. So we're left with a situation where Ohio doesn't have a state exchange. So you'd think then that the obvious thing would be Ohio will not get subsidies, right? The subsidies will not be available to people to purchase insurance with, neither employers nor individuals. But now enters on the scene the infamous IRS. And the IRS has made a final ruling. And their final ruling is simply this, that in spite of what the ACA says, the Affordable Care Act, in spite of the language of the bill, they don't care. Their final ruling is that the subsidies can flow through federal exchanges. And as I just said earlier, with the subsidies comes the penalties. How can an employer be penalized for not purchasing health care for their employees, for not purchasing the premium health care that ObamaCare defines, that the feds say is the only kind of health care you can buy? It's premium Cadillac coverages that cost a fortune. There's only one way they can be forced to buy those coverages, and that's through the penalties. There's no other sanctions. They can't be arrested. Nothing can happen to them except those penalties. And here's how the penalties are levied. If they don't offer insurance, number one, and one of their employees applies for a subsidy, their whole company has to pay penalties. They pay a penalty on every one of their employees, $2,000 a year. If just one of their employees applies for the subsidy and gets it. Or if they don't offer insurance that meets government-defined standards and they apply for a subsidy, again, they're penalized for every one of their employees that doesn't have the right insurance. So the only pathway the government has to charge an employer with the penalty is through those subsidies. You eliminate the subsidies, the penalties are gone. There's no reason for anybody to buy the ObamaCare insurance. And what the federal government is doing right now, the IRS, is illegal. And it's being challenged right now by Oklahoma in court. That final ruling was illegal. Unfortunately, the feds don't lose many of these battles. In spite of the fact that they're often wrong, many courts, somehow or another, find a way to support this federal government. So that's why we're introducing House Bill 91. What House Bill 91 is simply this. It tells the insurance carriers that if they accept those subsidies that could later trigger a penalty, that they will forfeit their license to do new business in the state of Ohio until that subsidy is returned to the federal government. Now you think, well, hey, what's the first thing you think of? It's going to be preempted, right? The feds are going to wade in there and they're going to say, hey, this is against the terms of the ACA. This stops our legislation from working. This kills our bill. And so therefore it's a dead issue. It'll be preempted. But numerous constitutional attorneys, and in these little packets that we handed out, you should have one on your table there, maybe a few of them. You have quotes from a couple of well-known constitutional attorneys. Michael Cannon is not a constitutional attorney. He's part of a think tank in Washington, the Cato Institute, and he consults with a number of them. There's a quote from him in there. Maurice Thompson here in Ohio, head of the 1851 Constitutional Association. They feel strongly it cannot be preempted, and here's why. A little bit of history is necessary here. When the ACA passed through the U.S. Senate, it passed with one vote. And if you've ever been in a legislative body, when they need one vote, they scour every dark corner of those halls in the U.S. Senate to find that one vote. And in this case, they needed the votes of a number of moderate Democrat senators. if there is such a thing as a moderate Democrat senator. But they found some. And what they held out for, what they insisted on, was maintaining state powers in reference to licensing and regulating their insurance carriers. So if you read through the ACA, there are numerous references, and I'm not an attorney, I can remember one in particular. It says that state powers in reference to licensing and regulating their insurance carriers will be maintained. And there's no hint at preemption. There's no suggestion of preemption. So the attorneys tell me, they tell Andy, that this cannot be preempted because we're following the language of Obamacare itself. This bill, if you read through the bill in some cases and the language associated with it, it actually quotes from the ACA to gain the authority and the power to function. So Michael Cannon, again of the Cato Institute, came up with the idea. He's a brilliant man. It's been reviewed by constitutional attorneys. They tell us it'll work. The biggest opponents we've had to date have been members of our own Republican Party. It's ironic because these same people, our opponents now, are the same people that helped pass Ohio's Healthcare Freedom Act 1.0 back in 2011. It's interesting to note that these people are very bright, our opponents, extremely bright people. And I ask myself the question, could it be that they knew back in 2011 that if Obamacare was maintained as being constitutional, that our Health Care Freedom Act, our constitutional amendment here in Ohio, would have no meaning because it'd be totally preempted anyway. And so could it be that all along they were supportive of passing Obamacare because a number of them are deeply embedded in the insurance industry? Could it be that they were supportive of Obamacare all along and this whole thing with supporting the Health Care Freedom Act was a facade? The wonderful thing about House Bill 91 is that it gives our legislature a chance to live up to our oath of office to support and defend the Ohio Constitution. Thank you. And yet again, it is extremely ironic to consider this, that these same people, these same colleagues of ours, are using the Health Care Freedom Act to say that House Bill 91 is unconstitutional. It just shows the depths they'll go to. They're suggesting that that the Health Care Freedom Act we passed was passed to actually defend Obamacare, that it was passed so that these Obamacare subsidies could flow through the insurance carriers. What they're saying is that House Bill 91 takes away the rights of insurance carriers to sell insurance. And so therefore it's unconstitutional under our Health Care Freedom Act. Of course, it doesn't do that. Our bill simply says that the subsidies can no longer be accepted. Not that they can't sell insurance. It just says they can't receive the subsidies. I'm getting a little bit convoluted here, I'm afraid. I can see a lot of confusion. But suffice to say that our opponents are Republicans, and their arguments have been weighed. Not a single attorney has stood up in support of their arguments. We have several attorneys supporting ours. We do this all the time in the House of Representatives. We get these warring battles of, we line up our attorneys on both sides of an issue, and they sort of fight it out as we watch. But the attorneys are supportive of our perspective on House Bill 91, both from a preemption argument from the Ohio Constitution and a preemption argument from the federal Constitution. This is a good bill. This is a solid bill. And I think I should take a question. Yes?
Is House Bill 91 before a committee now?
It is. It's the Health and Aging Committee. We've had sponsor testimony and proponent testimony. 2 hearings. We need more hearings. And the Ohio legislature, perhaps like a lot of other legislatures, particularly on the Republican team, has over the years become deeply appreciative of the insurance corporation's attentions. We put it that way. So, number 2 industry in the state of Ohio. So, there's a very strong relationship there. I think the insurance carriers don't recognize what's happening here long term, and Andy, I think, can address that very well.
Well, I wanted to make a point too. One of the dilemmas that we find as we try to oppose Medicaid expansion or Obamacare itself is the insurance companies and the hospital association were at the table helping implement Obamacare. They definitely thought if you can force people to buy your product, it's a great deal. And now, of course, the hospitals were complaining, well, geez, now, you know, you promised us if we helped you pass Obamacare that somehow we'd make these numbers work out. Of course, none of us was at the table, you know, so that's the problem. And, you know, the other thing that's happened under Obamacare is this whole consolidation of the industry now, right? Hospitals buying up doctors' practices so Obama can only have to pay one entity. That's terrible too. That's terrible for consumer choice. All of a sudden, it's, you know, kind of facilitating the monopolization of the whole industry. So there are a lot of bad things that Obamacare is doing. I think the fundamental goal is to eliminate private insurance, and that's the irony of this for the insurance companies. Do you really need a private insurance industry once you get to single payer? The answer is no. So what they're doing with Medicaid expansion, and the most likely outcome of Medicaid expansion, is to drive employers to dump their people onto Medicaid. And so they're no longer on private insurance, so we don't need private insurance for them anymore. And then Obamacare itself, what it's going to do is say your program, it's like the Goldilocks, some kind of Goldilocks phenomenon. Either it's too poor or too wealthy, your plan. So they'll disqualify all those people, and then the sliver of people in between won't be many, and eventually we'll eliminate them as well. So employers will tend to say, I'll go ahead and pay the penalty rather than provide insurance to my employees, and those people will fall into the loving clutches of the bureaucracy, and then there'll be even more of this. So there's a very strategic plan to get us to single payer. Obamacare is doing that. I wish that we didn't have you know, the hospitals and the insurance companies and frankly some in our own party enabling this, but that's what's going on right now. So I think you all, compared to any other entity out there, realizes this, and you're trying to mount a principled fight. We're doing that here in the Ohio legislature as well, and we appreciate your support, and I'll throw it back to Ron for any other questions.
I just wanted to say, and I know you have an agenda, you have to move on, but on your table are those packets, and there's a little form there. If you could fill that out, if you'd like, we'd like to send you updates on the progression of House Bill 91, maybe on Medicaid expansion as well. My aide is in the back there. Brandy, would you stand up for a second? Yeah, right. And you could just, Brandy will be here for a little while. Maybe you could drop those off with her. And we really appreciate the letter of support on House Bill 91 we received from your association. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. If you're from Ohio, please call your state senator. Call your state representatives. We're really swimming upstream on this. When the lobbyists are working against you, it's difficult to get things done. So those calls and those letters are very important right now. Well, do you have time for another question, or Dr. Tan? Go right ahead.
One other comment.
Yes.
You know, people who are running against doing away with Obamacare, against the Ohio Health Care Freedom Amendment, are actually being challenged by Tea Party folks. And so I don't know what you're hearing, but that's what I'm hearing a lot of.
The Tea Parties are thoroughly engaged on this. This is their #1 issue right now. The liberty groups, the Tea Parties, the libertarian groups, those folks are all standing up for this. The people that still support the Constitution as not necessarily as a living document, but the people support as it's written are all very supportive of this.
Do you have phone numbers of the people in the Ohio Senate and all the committees and so forth?
I don't believe, Brandy, did we bring those with us? Did we bring those with us?
Whom they should contact to show their support, whether it's the chairman of the...
No, that was my bad. I should have mentioned something. Well, you know,
To me, I'll tie up the phone. I mean, the people that don't want it, I'll annoy them to death.
well, that'd be great. Brandy, would you be sure and get the good doctor's information before? Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Really appreciate this opportunity.